April 1945. Baguio, Philippines. 24 Japanese women knelt in thick mud within a fortified compound, hands clasped in desperate prayer. They weren't praying for rescue. They were praying for a swift death. The sky hung dark above them, and in the distance, American voices echoed through the humid morning air. This was the ending they had been conditioned to expect. Quick, brutal, final. Before we continue with this extraordinary account, if these forgotten chapters of history resonate with you, please click like and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from, Tokyo, Texas, or anywhere between. Your support keeps these overlooked narratives alive. The women listened to boots approaching, heavy and purposeful. American soldiers. Lieutenant Yoshiko Nakamura closed her eyes and steadied her trembling breath. She had instructed the others to face death with dignity as servants of the emperor. Yet her heart pounded violently against her ribs. Propaganda images flashed through her mind, American soldiers laughing while bayoneting prisoners, American troops firing at villages, American forces showing no mercy. Then the footsteps halted. The compound gate swung open, but the Americans carried no weapons. Instead, they held boxes, blankets, and supplies. In that moment, in the Philippine highlands, these women realized everything they'd been told was a lie. The story of these 24 Japanese prisoners of war is one history has largely forgotten. No major publication documents their names. No film dramatizes their ordeal. Yet their experience reveals something profound about war, propaganda, and the persistence of human compassion in humanity's darkest hours. What transpired in that compound over the following weeks would shatter assumptions on both sides of the Pacific. It would demonstrate that even in total war, mercy can endure. To understand how these women came to kneel in mud anticipating execution, we must step back 6 months. In October 1944, United States forces under General Douglas MacArthur returned to the Philippines, fulfilling his famous promise. The Japanese garrison that had occupied the islands since 1942 now fought a desperate defensive campaign. Among the 30,000 Japanese personnel scattered throughout the region were approximately 200 women, nurses, clerical officers, administrative staff, and comfort station workers. The 1944 Japanese military code was unambiguous regarding capture. The Senjin-kun, the directive issued to all imperial forces, explicitly instructed soldiers never to survive the dishonor of imprisonment. Officers carried cyanide capsules. Soldiers were trained to use grenades on themselves rather than surrender. The concept of surrender was so alien to Japanese military culture that the word itself, kosan, carried extreme negative connotations. For Japanese women in uniform, the stakes were even higher. Military propaganda had convinced them that American soldiers were savages who raped and murdered prisoners without hesitation. These weren't random fears. They were deliberate constructions designed to prevent surrender and ensure personnel fought to the death. Japanese media showed fabricated footage of American atrocities. Radio broadcasts described invented massacres. Officers repeated these narratives until they became accepted truth. In March 1945, as American forces pushed into the mountainous region surrounding Baguio, the Japanese perimeter collapsed. Most Japanese troops retreated into mountain ranges to conduct guerrilla operations, but approximately 24 women were separated from the main force and left behind. For 3 weeks, they hid in abandoned structures, surviving on contaminated water and foraged roots. Sergeant Michiko Tanaka, 31, had served as a surgical nurse in Manchuria before deployment to the Philippines. She maintained a diary, fragments of which survived the war. On March 28th, she wrote, "We have no food, no medicine. Fever spreads. At night we hear American patrols passing. Every night I believe they'll find us. Tomorrow will be our final day." The capture occurred not violently, but through exhaustion. On April 1st, an American patrol discovered the women in a crumbling warehouse on Baguio's outskirts. Private Robert Chen, a Nisei interpreter attached to the unit, was present. His account, recorded in an interview with the National Archives, describes the scene. They were huddled in a corner, pressed together like frightened animals. Their uniforms were shredded. Some were barely clothed. When they saw us, they didn't flee. They simply closed their eyes and began praying. I thought they were praying for salvation. Later I understood they were praying for death. The women were transported to a temporary detention facility outside the city. It wasn't a traditional prisoner of war camp. American forces were advancing too rapidly to establish permanent installations. It was simply a guarded perimeter. Several tents, a latrine, a water source. The women were provided sleeping space and minimal rations. A bowl of rice twice daily, occasionally supplemented with dried fish. The American guards, mostly young men from the 33rd Division, had received minimal training on prisoner management. Most had never encountered a Japanese woman. The standing orders were straightforward: secure the perimeter, prevent escape, maintain humanitarian standards as outlined by the Geneva Convention. But the orders provided no guidance on what to do when prisoners refused to eat, because they believed the food was poisoned. For the first week, the women barely touched their meals. They remained convinced the Americans were fattening them before the real torture began. Nurse Fumiko Sato, 26, later testified through an interpreter. "We thought they were toying with us, like cats with mice. We waited daily for the game to end. Malnutrition and disease spread rapidly. Several women developed dysentery. Fumiko's condition worsened into pneumonia. Lieutenant Yoshiko Nakamura, the highest-ranking officer, attempted to maintain discipline, but it felt absurd. They were no longer soldiers, they were ghosts waiting to vanish. The compound presented a stark contrast. Outside the fence, American supply trucks rumbled past. Inside, 24 women existed in limbo between life and death, clinging to the only certainty they'd been taught, that Americans showed no mercy. Then came April 10th, the day everything changed. Captain William Morrison, 34, had been a history teacher at a Portland high school before the war. He landed at Leyte Gulf in October and fought northward, experiencing some of the Pacific Theater's bloodiest engagements. He had witnessed men die in ways that would haunt him forever. He had learned to compartmentalize, to view the enemy as merely enemy, to do what was necessary. But when he visited the detention compound that morning as part of a routine inspection, what he saw disrupted his compartmentalization. These weren't enemy combatants. They were starving, terrified women who appeared already dead inside. Morrison consulted with Private Chen, who explained the situation. The women believed they were being held for execution. They interpreted the meager rations as deliberate cruelty. They expected torture. Morrison stood there in the morning humidity, observing 24 human beings who had been so thoroughly dehumanized by their own propaganda that they couldn't recognize mercy. He made a decision not written in any manual. He turned to his sergeant and said, "Bring them breakfast, real breakfast, everything we have." Within an hour, soldiers returned with supplies from the division's depot. The aroma reached the compound before the boxes arrived, a smell the women hadn't experienced in months. Fresh meat in cans, fruit, coffee, chocolate bars. The American soldiers opened the containers in the compound center. Corporal James Rodriguez, 22, watched the women's faces. They simply stared, he later wrote to his sister, as if they couldn't believe what they were witnessing. One began weeping, then another, then all of them. Sergeant Michiko was the first to move. She slowly stood, approached the boxes, and picked up a can of meat. In the silence, she opened it and turned around. In her hands, she looked at Captain Morrison. She spoke in Japanese. Private Chen translated. "She's asking if it's poisoned." Morrison took the can from her hands, opened it with a knife, and ate with a fork. Then he returned it to her. "Tell her it's safe," he said. "Tell them they won't die today." The barrier broke. The women moved forward, not frantically, but with cautious deliberation. They handled the food as if it might disappear. Some sat immediately and ate. Others carried food to the sick women who couldn't stand. Ayuki Harada, 19 and the youngest, took a chocolate bar and held it like a sacred relic. Then she said through the interpreter, "I thought I was dreaming. I thought I'd died, and this was some kind of afterlife. I couldn't comprehend why our enemies were giving us food." But the food was merely the beginning. Over the next 3 days, Captain Morrison requisitioned medical supplies. A military physician examined Fumiko and administered sulfur drugs for her pneumonia. The muddy ground was covered with canvas tarps. A proper latrine was constructed. The makeshift area transformed into something resembling an actual prisoner-of-war facility. The change in the women was gradual, but visible. They began eating regularly, color returned to their faces. The constant tension dissipated. But the psychological transformation was slower. Lieutenant Yoshiko struggled most. She had been trained as an officer, conditioned to uphold the Emperor's honor. But what was honor when your enemy provided food? What was discipline when your own military had abandoned you? She had been taught for years that Americans were monsters. Now, those monsters were treating her wounds and teaching her English words. The Americans wrestled with their own contradictions. These were enemy Japanese women. The same military that had bombed Pearl Harbor, that had committed atrocities throughout Asia, that had killed their friends in battles from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. Yet, here they were, sharing cigarettes and chocolate, teaching them card games, showing photographs of families. Corporal Rodriguez engaged in a philosophical discussion with Private Eddie Walsh. "I don't understand," said Walsh. "We're supposed to kill them on the battlefield, but here we're supposed to be kind. Where's the line?" Rodriguez thought about it. "Maybe there is no line," he said. "Maybe that's the point. Toward the end of April, something extraordinary emerged. Not quite friendship, the gulf was too vast for that. But something more significant. Recognition. Recognition that the enemy was human. Recognition that humanity persisted even when everything else failed. The Japanese women began teaching the American guards basic Japanese phrases. The Americans taught them English in return. They shared stories cautiously at first, then more openly. Sergeant Michiko consulted with American medics on treating the sick. Her knowledge was respected. Lieutenant Yoshiko found herself discussing logistics with Captain Morrison. Where to dig latrines, how to organize the sleeping area. Practical matters that required no ideology, just common sense. One afternoon in early May, a sudden tropical downpour forced everyone to seek shelter. Private Yuki ended up beneath a canvas roof with 3 American soldiers. They sat watching the rain, and someone passed around a pack of Lucky Strikes. For 20 minutes, they were simply people sheltering from a storm. When the rain stopped, Yuki looked at the soldiers and said in halting English, "Same rain, same sky." One of the soldiers, Private Danny O'Brien, nodded to her. "Yeah," he said, "same rain." It was a brief moment, easily forgotten. But it represented something monumental, a crack in the certainties that war required. A glimpse of the world as it actually was, not as propaganda painted it. The war in the Philippines was effectively over. The Japanese defensive lines were crumbling. Surviving forces were scattered in the mountains, cut off from supplies. On May 8th, Germany surrendered as well. The war in the Pacific continued, but everyone could sense it was entering its final phase. Captain Morrison received orders to transfer the prisoners to a larger facility in Manila. The compound would be dismantled. The Americans would move north. The brief, strange community that had formed would dissolve. The night before the transfer, Morrison gathered the women. He explained through Chen what would happen. They would go to Manila. They would receive proper care. Eventually, when the war ended, they would be repatriated to Japan. The women listened in silence. Sergeant Michiko finally spoke. Chen translated, "She's asking if you'll be in Manila." Morrison shook his head. "No, my unit is moving elsewhere. I wish you well." Then he bowed deeply and formally. The other women followed her gesture. It wasn't submission, it was respect, gratitude, recognition. Morrison, uncomfortable with formality, returned the bow awkwardly. "You deserve to be treated like human beings," he said. "I'm glad we managed at least that much." The next morning, trucks arrived to transport the women to Manila. As they prepared to depart, each woman said goodbye to the soldiers they had come to know. Lieutenant Yoshiko shook hands with Captain Morrison. "You have proven," she said in practiced English, "that everything we were told was wrong." "Maybe that's the real victory," Morrison said, "discovering that the enemy is made of people just like us." The women arrived in Manila on May 12th. They were transferred to a larger facility, housing several hundred Japanese prisoners. The infrastructure was better equipped than the Baguio compound. A real infirmary, organized mess halls, recreational areas. But something was lost in the transition. The intimacy of the small compound, the daily interactions reminding both sides they were human, was replaced by institutional bureaucracy. The psychological aftermath emerged slowly. Fumiko struggled with nightmares. She dreamed of being back in the compound, but in her dreams, the Americans were as monstrous as propaganda had depicted. She woke confused, uncertain about what was real. Lieutenant Yoshiko faced a crisis of identity. She had been an officer of the Imperial Army. But what did that mean now? Her military had abandoned her. Her nation was losing. The enemy had shown more honor than her own commanders. Private Yuki, the youngest, adapted most easily. She was barely out of adolescence, less rigidly conditioned by military indoctrination. She befriended some civilian prisoners, learned more English, and even began teaching Japanese to some American staff. She was building something new from the ruins. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over the radio, announcing Japan's surrender. The war was over. In the Manila facility, the announcement brought mixed emotions. For many, the outcome was unthinkable. Some refused to believe it. Others wept openly. Sergeant Michiko sat silently, tears streaming down her face. Defeat, displacement, years lost. She thought of Captain Morrison and the Americans who had fed her when she was waiting for death. They had won more than the war. They had demonstrated that even in chaos, humanity could survive. The repatriation process took months. The women from Baguio waited in Manila, writing letters to families they weren't sure still existed. In November, they boarded a United States Navy transport ship bound for Japan. As Lieutenant Yoshiko embarked, the ship's captain asked her, "What will you tell your people?" "I will tell them," she said, "that the enemy taught me more about honor than my own commanders ever did." 12 days later, they docked at Uraga port. Japan was in ruins. Cities burned, people starving, hope desolate. Coming home was harder than captivity. Michiko found her village near Hiroshima half destroyed, but her family alive. She embraced her mother and wept. But Michiko could not remain silent. She worked in a local clinic and told patients about the Americans who had brought breakfast. Some doubted her. An elderly doctor said, "Perhaps that's how we rebuild, not with weapons, but with empathy." Yoshiko reunited with her husband, a naval officer. Their first conversations were painful. He had fought against the Americans while she had learned to see them as people. Slowly, they found common ground in exhaustion and the desire for peace. Yuki, only 20, struggled most. She had known only war, yet she found purpose teaching English in Yokohama. When students asked where she learned, she answered, "From the enemy. The men who taught me that enemies can become teachers." In 1947, 15 of the 24 women met in Tokyo. During a modest meal, they toasted their survival. Yoshiko said, "To survival." Fumiko added, "To the men who showed us that survival can be honorable." Yuki whispered, "To second chances." And Michiko simply said, "To remembering how humanity persisted even during war." The reunions decreased over time. In 1982, historian Thomas Nakamura interviewed Michiko, now 73. She showed him her diary. "The Americans brought us food," she read. "How can one make sense of enemies who feed us?" She paused. "The worst lies are the ones that show us others as less than human." Captain Morrison returned home simply. No medals, no recognition, just breakfast. In 2003, a small memorial stone was placed in Tokyo. It read, "To those who chose mercy when war demanded cruelty, to the breakfast that changed everything." Thank you for witnessing this powerful story of humanity transcending hatred. If this moved you, please subscribe for more forgotten narratives from history. See you in the next episode.